German Chancellor Angela Merkel has arrived in Brussels on her first international trip since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. She will meet with the heads of the EU's main institutions to discuss Germany's EU Council presidency, which is to be dominated by economic recovery. Merkel is expected to make the case for a massive relief fund for European economies struggling with the coronavirus pandemic. This is the second time that Germany has headed the important EU body. And after her arrival, Chancellor Merkel took time to speak to journalists. Here's what she had to say.
I am happy that my first trip abroad after the outbreak of the pandemic is to Brussels and to the European Parliament. Today, I will present the priorities of the German presidency of the Council. The next few months will be all about the great task of trying to contain the pandemic and cope with its consequences. Health consequences, social consequences, and economic consequences.
Let's bring in our correspondent in Brussels. Richard Walker is there for us. Hi, Richard. Tell us more about what Germany's plans are for the next 6 months.
Yeah, well, as we just heard Angela Merkel speaking. She's now just entered the chamber. And I think one thing that she said on her arrival here that really kind of says it all, this isn't the council presidency that we were anticipating. And that really says it all. It really is about the economic recovery that is going to be the primary focus of the next 6 months, especially the weeks ahead with a summit coming up next week. So what is the plan? Angela Merkel herself has been really someone right at the forefront of this, saying that Europe needs a recovery plan to stimulate the economy, to pull it out of what could be a really, really devastating recession, even depression. And to give you a taste of how bad things are, there were new numbers out of the European Commission just yesterday forecasting that the EU economy would contract by more than 8% this year. That is really a dramatic contraction, something that hasn't been seen in the European Union's history. So the idea is to put together a plan running to hundreds of billions of euros to stimulate the economies, particularly in economies that have been worse hit, because what we're seeing also from the economic data is that the impact of the coronavirus is not being evenly spread. There are some countries that are being hit economically as well as by the pandemic much harder than others. For example, Spain and Italy. They're really looking to Merkel to provide leadership on that.
And as you've been speaking, we've been looking at some pictures of Chancellor Merkel. As you said, she'd entered the chamber. We saw the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen seated there as well. I want to ask you about that economic recovery package, because this is so important moving forward. And yet there is some controversy over this hundreds of billions of euro that's supposed to provide economic stimulus and recovery. Where are the hurdles right now?
Yeah, so I mean, it feels like everyone pretty well agrees that some major, bold recovery plan is needed. But of course, when it comes down to it, this is money we're talking about, and that is always a matter of massive discussions. And there are debates about virtually every aspect that you could imagine. The scale of the fund, so the number of 750 billion euros is what the European Commission is talking about. Angela Merkel herself, together with the French President Emmanuel Macron, came out with a plan just before that, saying 500 billion was the right amount. There are some countries that have been dubbed the Frugal Four, a group of smaller northern European countries saying that they want a fund to be smaller. So that's one issue. What kind of nature should the fund have? Should it give out money as grants, or should it lend money which countries then have to pay back? Now, that's a big question. Those Frugal Four are keen for it mostly to be about lending so that money is paid back. The countries that need the money most, Italy and Spain, of course, are saying, no, what's the point if you just lend us the money? This is only going to make our economic situation more difficult. Then there's an East versus West kind of divide that has emerged over this, with countries in Eastern Europe, which are poorer than countries like France and Spain and Italy, saying, well, why should we be helping out these countries even if they've had a bigger economic impact? We're still behind them in economic development. So there's any kind of multiplicity of these different divisions that Angela Merkel is really going to try and straddle in the next few weeks. But I think one kind of symbolic thing that she's done is she's really kind of glued herself to Emmanuel Macron of France, on this, made clear that the two of them are going to be working very closely together. I think their hope is that Angela Merkel can kind of rally Germany's traditional kind of slightly more frugally minded countries in Northern Europe. France can hold together these southern European countries and try and find some unity there. But even beyond that, this issue with East and West could turn out to be just as difficult.
Okay, a tall task ahead for Chancellor Merkel and Germany as it takes on the EU Council presidency. Richard Walker for us there in Brussels. We'll be coming back to you in a little bit. Thank you. I believe we have pictures of her just beginning to speak. If we can bring those pictures up, we'll listen in to Chancellor Merkel. Here we go.
Like many of you, I have missed the direct in-person contact. This is my first trip since the pandemic started, and I deliberately chose to come here to the heart of European democracy at a time when the European Union wishes to stand resolute in the face of this crisis. At such a time, the EU needs the European Parliament. There are huge challenges ahead that require enormous effort. We need parliamentary debate, we need political coordination, cultural translation and mediation between different countries and regions. And so we need you, and it is a particular honour for me today to present the priorities of the German presidency. There are 5 priorities, I feel, at the current juncture. Fundamental rights, cohesion, climate protection, digitalisation, and Europe's responsibility in the world. These 5 priorities are very important because we need sustainable change in Europe to safeguard, preserve Europe. Only in this way will Europe cope with the lightning speed of change and ensure its sovereignty and responsibility and fully live up to its role. We are all aware that my visit today comes at a time when the European Union is facing its greatest challenge ever. The global pandemic has hit people hard in Europe. Over 100,000 lives have been lost in Europe alone. Many citizens were not able to visit loved ones because of strict quarantine rules, bid farewell to them as they passed. We must bear that in mind when we commit to economic recovery. We need to mourn our dead, recognise the pain of farewells that were not possible. That will stay with us for some time to come. Our economy has been dealt a severe blow. Millions have lost their jobs. They are also worried about their own health, the health of their family members. In addition, many citizens fear for their very livelihoods. They need our shared common support. We need to break transmission chains. To this end, the most basic fundamental rights had to be restricted. That was a high price to pay. Generations in Europe fought hard for those fundamental rights. Human rights, civil liberties are the most valuable asset we have in Europe. Only for very important reasons, for a short space of time, should such rights be restricted. A pandemic should never be used as a pretext to erode democratic principles. All countries in Europe has a different recollection of the upheaval of the past, the fight for freedom, rule of law, democracy. But those achievements form the basis of fundamental rights in Europe. Now, for me personally, I spent 35 years of my life in an unfree society, and so restricting rights during the pandemic really was a very difficult decision for me. Germany is taking on the European Council presidency at an important time. We will show great respect and invest great passion into this challenge. I believe in Europe. I am a fervent advocate of Europe, not just as a legacy from the past, but as a harbinger of hope for the future. Europe is not something passed down to us, some sort of fate that is incumbent upon us. Europe is a living project that we can shape and change. Europe does not restrict our room for manoeuvre. In a globalized world, Europe gives us more room for manoeuvre. It is only with Europe that we can maintain our freedoms. And so more than ever before, we need to focus on fundamental rights. We need mutual assistance and support, solidarity, a community spirit. Europe will only be safeguarded if we offer innovative responses to the challenges of climate change, digitalization, and our responsibility in the world. Those are the huge challenges facing us. But I am confident. Look back at the various tests and trials that Europe has already overcome. The failed draft treaty, the constitutional treaty 15 years ago, the economic and financial crisis and the tough battles we had then, or the mass movement of refugees 5 years ago. It's never been easy. There have always been moments of hurt. But the most bitter crises have helped us to listen, to better understand the needs and concerns of others. We have learned together. Europe has overcome all these crises because at the end of the day, everyone is aware of what is invaluable: fundamental rights and cohesion. Human rights, civil liberties, human dignity, civic rights, all those various rights, the protection against discrimination, equality, genuine equality, all these values form the cornerstone, the ethical cornerstone of the EU. These rights apply to everyone, not just for some, and for some more, less for others. Not just for some of the time, and for others will not always. They apply always across the board, and that is what we must guarantee through the EU. That is its promise. Citizens must be free. They must enjoy religious freedom, political, cultural freedom. They must be able to explore their own happiness. Democracy, European democracy, requires open, critical debate. We don't want to stifle opposition. Such a democracy where religious, social, cultural diversity is silenced is no true democracy. The pandemic has made clear to all how valuable fundamental rights are, how basic our freedoms are, how essential they are. We must safeguard those fundamental rights. And to that end, Europe needs strong institutions, the Commission, the Court of Justice and the European Parliament. Fundamental rights are the priority that I see at the start of the presidency. And that brings me on to cohesion. Europe will only emerge from the crisis stronger than ever if we are willing to overcome our differences and identify shared solutions, if we are willing to view the world through the prism of others. Europe will emerge from the crisis stronger than ever if we strengthen cohesion and solidarity. No one will get through this crisis alone. We are all vulnerable. European solidarity is not just a humanitarian gesture. It is a sustainable investment. European solidarity isn't just a political imperative. It is well worth our while. It will yield benefits, and that is the leitmotif of our presidency, together for Europe's recovery. I will work together with the German government and invest great passion to that end, but I need you too. We need to safeguard Europe. We need the Parliament to that end. You mediate between the different views and help to strike compromise. You represent 450 million citizens across 27 member states. You translate European principles. You explain Europe to citizens and mediate between Brussels, Strasbourg and your home regions. You communicate in 24 different languages and you experience diversity and various experiences on a daily basis. Only with you can we explain Europe to the different member states. So I ask you to be mediators and to help secure cohesion at this difficult time. Help to foster greater understanding, mutual understanding. Help us to strengthen European cohesion. The top priority in the German presidency will be unity in Europe to ensure that Europe emerges more united from the crisis. But we don't just want a short-term fix. That would not be enough. We want a Europe that offers hope, that is confident and brave in tackling the challenges of the current day. We want a future-proofed Europe, innovative, sustainable Europe that can take its place in the world. We want to see a stronger Europe. And this prompted the Franco-German proposal mid-May. Together with Emmanuel Macron, the French president, I suggested a European recovery fund of €500 billion. I am delighted to note that the European Commission has taken on board many facets of that Franco-German proposal in its MFF proposal and proposal for a recovery fund. That will be discussed now at the European Council under the leadership of Charles Michel. We want to reach agreement swiftly. We have seen huge economic upheaval and we cannot waste any time. Only the weakest and most vulnerable would suffer. I hope that we will reach an agreement before the summer recess. We will need to see compromise, much compromise on all sides, including here. This is an extraordinary situation, unprecedented in the history of the European Union. And so, in extraordinary times, Germany is willing to defend an extraordinary sum of 500 billion. We need European unity. I firmly believe that the social dimension is just as important as the economic dimension. We need a socially and economically fair Europe. That is key to democratic cohesion. It is the best way to tackle all those that would undermine our democracy and rend us asunder. For this reason, during our Council presidency, we will focus in particular on young people, children's rights. You are the future of Europe, and you have been particularly hard hit by this crisis. We want to look at a European youth employment agenda, a stronger European youth guarantee. We want to help young people find employment. We shouldn't be naive. In many member states, Eurosceptics are waiting to misuse this crisis to their own ends. We need to demonstrate the added value of cooperation and coordination at European level. We must show that return to nationalism would reduce us all. We can only progress if we protect Europe together. It is very important that those regions worst affected by the crisis and the people living there can count on our solidarity. It is in our own interests to ensure that. That also means that huge effort is required, but it should not add an excessive burden to the stronger economies. Everyone will have to place themselves in another's shoes. So consider what the different member states can contribute and not in economic, political and societal terms. So I would ask you as MEPs to offer your support today. I firmly believe that extraordinary solidarity is called for, and everyone is willing to show that during this crisis. Germany is. The repercussions of the pandemic will mark and shape our presidency, but there are other major challenges of the day that we need to bear in mind. And those are the other three topics I wanted to mention. Firstly, climate change. Half a year ago, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen outlined a climate protection programme in this chamber. She addressed the urgency of the matter to you, called for immediate action. Europe needs to act to preserve our planet. I firmly believe that we need a global solution to climate protection, and that will only be possible if Europe takes the lead. We have a European Green Deal strategy proposed by the Commission, and that is very important for us. We will closely support that with a move towards a low-carbon society, a green society with strong, innovative companies and entrepreneurship. We need to look at the natural resources and competitiveness of Europe and protect those assets for future generations. It's very important that we have climate neutrality in Europe by 2050, and that must be made legally binding. I welcome the Commission's thinking to set targets for 2030 and increase those targets to 50–55% compared to 1990 levels. We will also support work on the European climate law. Another major challenge, the fourth point that is very important to us during our presidency, is digitalisation. Here too, we need to look at the way we live and do business and change that in a sustainable fashion. Now, many people are fearful at the thought. They fear the pace of change, and I can understand that. But let me be clear here and frank. We need a commitment to digitalisation and climate protection. That doesn't mean that we will sweep away everything and endanger the jobs of millions of Europeans. Quite the opposite. This is a much-needed change, reform of our societies and economies that will offer greater protection and employment. In recent months, we've seen how Europe is reliant on third countries. Many have seen this in daily digital communications, the different services or technology available. It is very important that Europe enjoys digital sovereignty, particularly in key areas such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing, also in ensuring a secure, trustworthy data infrastructure. We want to make progress in these areas. We also need to effectively protect our democracies against cyber threats and disinformation. All democracies need open debate, and the general public must be able to share knowledge and information. Citizens need to be able to engage in debate to reach a mutual understanding as to how they can live together. We have seen lies and disinformation, and that is no way to fight the pandemic. We can't allow hate speech and incitement to hatred, populism and the like to spread. Democracies need truth and transparency. That is the hallmark of Europe, and that is what Germany will advocate for and push for during its presidency. Fifth point, Europe's responsibility in a globalized world. Now look at any map. Now, in addition to the UK and Western Balkans, we have other external neighbours: Russia, Belarus, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. At the same time, we are living at a time of huge upheaval. Many member states in Europe are involved in the transatlantic partnership, but Europe needs to rely more on itself. We need to be able to decide the future of Europe in this rapidly changing world. We need to decide whether we take Europe seriously, whether we want Europe's freedom and identity to be safeguarded in times of crisis. So we need a strong European foreign and security policy. Now, one key partner will remain the United Kingdom. We need to shape our future relationship, and that will keep us busy over the next 6 months. Progress in negotiations thus far have been slim, to put it diplomatically. We've agreed with the United Kingdom to accelerate the pace of talks to reach an agreement by autumn, an agreement that can be ratified by the end of the year. I will continue to push for a good solution, but we should also prepare for a possible no-deal scenario. During our presidency, we need to do everything within our power to focus on 3 further foreign policy goals. Firstly, on accession conferences, we need to engage in talks with North Macedonia and Albania so that the Western Balkans have accession prospects. We also need to look at our relationship with our neighbouring continent, Africa. We will have an EU-AU conference, and we need to look at future prospects. We'll talk about migration, for example. There are so many people, unprecedented numbers fleeing, and so Europe has a key responsibility here when it comes to asylum and refugee policy. We need to make progress here. It is very politically sensitive, and we need to show that sensitivity, but we cannot look the other way. We need to face up to our humanitarian responsibilities and show solidarity. Finally, we need to look at our strategic relationship with China. We have a trade relationship, but we have different societal and political views, particularly when it comes to human rights and rule of law. The EU-China summit, unfortunately, cannot take place in September, but we want to continue open, frank dialogue with China. During the German presidency, we will continue discussions on foreign and security policy, whether we want to retain the unanimity principle or not, what lessons Europe can learn from the coronavirus pandemic. For example, sovereignty in the healthcare sector, how we can strengthen our sovereignty in this area. We want to consider these issues as part of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Last year, the European Commission suggested such a conference, and you have many ideas on this conference. I would urge that the conference focus on a few key issues to deliver tangible results, so that citizens across different member states can engage in discussions. I've already discussed this today with David Sassoli, the President of the European Parliament. President, Commission President, ladies and gentlemen, do we want to safeguard Europe? Then we need all that I've discussed today: fundamental rights, cohesion, a response to climate change and digitalisation. Europe needs to face its responsibility in the world. We need a greener, more digital, more innovative, more competitive Europe. Europe needs to stand for a rules-based order on the world stage, and it must represent innovation and sustainability around the world. That is our vision for Europe. Perhaps I could conclude with a personal note. It is a particularly wonderful that I'm delighted to note that during our presidency, Ludwig van Beethoven will be commemorated in December. Whenever I listen to his music, I discover something new that really touches me. The same can be said of Europe. We rediscover it new each and every day, and I'm always impressed by Europe. So I would finish up by referring to the message of Beethoven's music, and I hope that that will guide us into the future. What better message is there than his? Europe is capable if we stick together and if we stand united. Thank you very much.
Thank
you, Chancellor Merkel. I'll now give the floor to the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Go ahead.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you've seen German Chancellor Angela Merkel there addressing the European Parliament as Germany's been has just taken over the rotating EU Council presidency. We heard Chancellor Merkel talking about the shared values. And now we're going to listen to the Commission President von der Leyen.
Wir freuen uns auf die deutsche Ratspräsidentschaft.
We truly look forward to the beginning of the German Council presidency. You don't choose Council presidencies, of course. They are allocated by a strict rota, and Germany now has its term during a time that with challenges that nobody could predict. The expectations of the German presidency are high, but that is a positive thing because it means that we place our trust in you. Ladies and gentlemen, the corona crisis has caused so many things into question. On the economic side, the social side, and so many things that we have been taking for granted, the way we perceive ourselves and the way we perceive our relationship with others. And all of this takes place against a backdrop when the structures that have existed for so long are becoming gradually fragile. We are called upon to think about the value of solidarity, community. We are beginning to rethink about the future of our Europe that needs to be reshaped on an ongoing basis. And it's true that at the beginning we tended to look at the small things and lose sight of the big picture. But we pulled ourselves together and saw the situation through European eyes and felt the situation with a European heart. So, Madam Chancellor, it was also because of the German contribution to discussions that responsibility for everything as a whole once again came into focus. We've heard the words and seen actions that give us hope across the continent. And everything that is good for Europe must also be good for us. And when I hear that, I see that this is the guiding principle, this is the zeitgeist we're living in now that's been rediscovered, this responsibility for the whole. I think that is going to be a very sound basis for a presidency, and it will set the course for the future of the Union.
The challenge ahead of you, the rotating presidency, and ahead of us all in the next 6 months could not be more extraordinary. And in the last 6 months, more than 100,000 lives have been lost in Europe because of COVID-19. We have entered the worst recession since almost 100 years. The summer forecast from yesterday shows a contraction of more than 8% this year, with only a partial rebound next year. This crisis is deeper and it is way broader than the one 10 years ago. But the one 10 years ago is still vividly present in the memories. And some of our member states during that crisis endured skyrocketing youth unemployment. They saw young people leaving home in droves to search for job opportunities elsewhere. They saw an unprecedented drop in public investment to historical low levels, all of which ultimately damaged public programs and public infrastructure severely. And for many, this was a traumatizing experience. But it does not have to be that way. In other parts of our union, the economy was supported by strong public investment from the very beginning of the crisis. People were able to stay in their jobs. That was when the concept of Kurzarbeit was implemented on a large scale. And this allowed some to come out stronger from the crisis than they went in it. And we should draw lessons from this, and this time we should do it together. If we do it right, we can also emerge stronger from this crisis thanks to a common European purpose and thanks to Next Generation EU. And this presidency has chosen one word at the core of its programme: gemeinsam, together, tous ensemble. And that's the engine of our union. Honourable members, there are 2 points I want to emphasise. First of all, solidarity means that those who need it get more support. But what it does not intensify is a lack of action. And that is why in Next Generation EU, investment is linked to reforms based on our existing country-specific recommendation in the European semester. And let me tell you, each and every member state has homework to do. There's not one member state that has not country-specific recommendations that should be linked as reforms to the investment. And if we want to come out stronger from this crisis, we must all change for the better. There's not a single member state that is exempted from that. We must all change to the better. And this is also what European people expect from us. They are certainly very different in their individual expectations, but they are completely united in wanting to drink clean water, to breathe fresh air, to see their children grow up in nature. And what they certainly not want is that politics contributes to increased flooding, to heat waves, to droughts, and to the loss of millions of species. And this is a very real scenario in case of non-action. And therefore, economic recovery is inseparable from the European Green Deal, as well from digitalisation, and as well inseparable from resilience. And my second point is, do not neglect the core MFF, our 7-year budget over Next Generation EU. We need them both. Next Generation EU is for the acute crisis, but the MFF is there to stay. It is the most important tool to implement our long-term goals: research, innovation, migration, foreign policy, security, just to name a few. And these policies need real European added value, and they need a strong 7-year budget to bring all that to life. Honourable members, all this has to be agreed now, in the next weeks, to clear the path for all the other topics that we want to tackle. By the end of the year, we will have to chart the path towards our goal of a climate-neutral Europe. In September, we will propose the European Union's new 2030 climate target, underpinned by a robust impact assessment. And here, cooperation with the European Parliament and the European Council will be vital. We will also aim to click the digital transition into a higher gear. Et mesdames et messieurs les députés,
Honourable members,
au cours de cette présidence,
over the course of this presidency, we will do our utmost to ensure that an agreement can be reached with the United Kingdom in order to ensure that we can respect the core principles that bind us in Europe. And it's, of course, important for us to maintain strong transatlantic relations, even if there are many problems, and partnership with Africa is at the very heart of the Council presidency, as it is also at the very core of my own Commission programme. It's at the front line of this virus, but we must show very clearly that our partnership with Africa is not a good time partnership, but that solidarity prevails even when things get tough. And we should continue to work with China to establish a partnership that is more balanced. At long last, the time has come to open a conference on the future of Europe. We all want to get it started as soon as the health conditions are right. And it's for all those reasons that I am truly pleased to be able to count on the experience of Germany, and the Council meeting last week showed us very clearly that this is the time to come together.
Relancer l'Europe. Merci beaucoup.
Grazie. Grazie alla Presidente von der Leyen. Adesso ascoltiamo i Presidenti dei gruppi politici.
From the political group presidents, starting with Manfred Weber for the European People's Party.
Chancellor Merkel, President von der Leyen.
All right, if you're just joining us now here on DW, you've been watching some scenes there from the European Parliament in Brussels. We saw the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen speaking there about the unprecedented challenge presented by the coronavirus pandemic. And just before that, we saw Chancellor Angela Merkel delivering a statement outlining Germany's priorities for its 6-month EU Council presidency, which it took over on July 1st. We should say this was the Chancellor's first trip abroad since the pandemic, and she talked about the need for cohesion and solidarity in taking on the challenges of this pandemic. And we have our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, with us here in studio, and Richard Walker has been over in Brussels listening in to those statements as well. Richard, we'll start with you there in Brussels. We heard from Chancellor Merkel a pretty wide-ranging speech. She was really drilling down on some of those shared values in the European Union. How do you think that's going to go down there in Brussels?
Yeah, well, I think it was the kind of speech that we would have expected from Angela Merkel, appealing on all sorts of European themes, trying to push some European emotional buttons during her speech, talking about the music of Beethoven just at the end and really calling for this sense of togetherness, which is the slogan of the German presidency this year, talking about making Europe recover stronger together. I think it was quite interesting at the beginning. She had a fairly long section of the speech talking about rights, which is something that we weren't necessarily expecting her to emphasize on the level that she did. And it was quite interesting that one or two comments in there came across potentially as implicit jabs against particular member states. Hungary came to mind when she was talking about the lockdown that was imposed during the corona crisis. Suggesting that a crisis like this should never be used as a reason to impose unnecessary draconian powers. And there was a lot of criticism of Hungary during the crisis for imposing an open-ended state of emergency as the pandemic really hit. So that was one thing that was really quite interesting to hear from her. But overall, really emphasizing this sense of togetherness, which is going to be needed for all the countries in the European Union to pull together to try and find a deal on this economic recovery fund that we just talked about earlier, really a rallying cry from her on that.
Yeah, togetherness there, Richard, is the key. That is actually the motto for Germany's presidency of the EU Council. Melinda, coming to you now, what is the view from here in Germany? I mean, this really is a big moment for Chancellor Angela Merkel, isn't it, as Germany takes over this rotating presidency and has all these priorities?
Indeed, and I think there is broad support here in Germany for this presidency to play a bold role in Europe. The Chancellor has emphasized from her very first public remarks during the corona crisis that this is the biggest crisis Europe has ever faced in its history, and she repeated that here. And she has also told Germans again and again, essentially preparing themselves for the job they now have to do in the next 6 months, that it is imperative for Germany that the rest of Europe do well. There's a clear economic reason for that, and it is the fact that Germany is one of the world's most open economies. It is a trading nation. It is an export master. And 70% of its trade, just about, both imports and exports, is with the rest of Europe. In other words, if the rest of Europe is languishing, Germany will certainly languish too. So I think when you hear her talking about the survival of Europe, this isn't just a phrase for her. This isn't just boilerplate. This is something that she knows and she is trying to convey both to the European Union Parliament, as we saw there, but to her own citizens as well, that this is serious, and we have to take bold action that we might not have been willing to take before if we want to see Europe survive.
Well, central to that survival is, of course, the economic recovery of the bloc. And Richard, coming back to you now, one of the biggest priorities for Chancellor Merkel, something we heard her touch upon, of course, is this multi-billion euro coronavirus recovery plan, which is incredibly important for the wealthier and the poorer European states. And she didn't mince her words when she said that this has to happen very soon. But there's controversy on this plan. Tell us what the challenges are there.
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of challenges in really trying to thrash this out. So, I mean, there are basically kind of two plans that are the genesis of what is being discussed now. One which Germany and France put forward together a few weeks ago of 500 billion euros for the whole bloc, that would be primarily made up of grants, so that money that countries would not have to pay back when they receive it. Then the European Commission followed with a plan of 750 billion euros, and that is now the basis for discussion, but with a higher proportion of loans, so money that would have to be paid back. And there's going to be a lot of haggling ahead over, what is the balance between grants and loans, with countries that would see themselves more as contributors, saying that they wanted to be more loans, countries who would more be on the receiving end of the money, of course, saying that they don't want to be saddled with more debt. They want the money to come as grants. But it was quite interesting to listen to some of the messaging from Ursula von der Leyen, from the Commission President, about this in her speech, because kind of connecting in with what Melinda was just talking about there with Angela Merkel, talking about how essential it is to do this. Ursula von der Leyen's message was essentially saying that there was an implication there that Europe didn't really get it right 10 years ago with the massive financial crisis that hit, of course, around 2008, 2009. That many countries, particularly in southern Europe, were left with extremely high and very long-lasting youth unemployment, which really hurt an entire generation of young people. And she was saying that we don't need to do that this time. And it was quite interesting to hear it from her because, of course, she's a member of Angela Merkel's close coterie, somebody who herself was associated with the government, during that time. Angela Merkel was seen at the time as somebody who was sort of imposing the type of austerity on those southern European countries. So it was interesting for von der Leyen to be saying, we've kind of learned from that. We want to do things differently this time, and that Europe needs to stick together to achieve that.
Melinda, what do you think Chancellor Merkel has learned from the last crisis? It was accused of, Germany was accused at the time, 10 years ago, of not doing enough for the solidarity of Europe. What do you think has changed as Germany takes over this rotating presidency?
I think what has changed for the Chancellor, first of all, is that she is at the end of her term. She recognizes the severity of this crisis, and she knows that this is her moment to shape her legacy. It's her history book moment. And the fact is, she was a foot dragger. She has a very ambivalent record on Europe. But together with French President Macron in May, she took a step that I think very few people expected to see her take, namely to recommend not only this very large, ambitious recovery plan of 500 billion, but also to say that the European Commission should be permitted to borrow on the markets. That means joint borrowing, something that Germany has long opposed. It's not quite the mutualization of past debt that some would have liked to see during the financial crisis, but it is a very major step for the Chancellor to be taking. Why is she doing that? She told us that just now in her speech. She talked about cohesion and solidarity and said we must have shared solutions because we have to see things from the perspective of the others. That, too, is a reference to the fact that the North often tends to have its own perspective on frugality and forget about the interests of the South. So she basically is saying we are all in this together. And the fact is, if that North-South divergence widens, if this money doesn't get to those southern countries soon, Europe truly is at stake. Its very existence.
Well, we have a clip of Chancellor Merkel talking about that solidarity. Let's listen to that.
If we are willing to overcome our differences and identify shared solutions, if we are willing to view the world through the prism of others, Europe will emerge from the crisis stronger than ever if we strengthen cohesion and solidarity. No one will get through this crisis alone. We are all vulnerable.
All right, so a call for cohesion and solidarity there. Just very quick wrap up from both of you. Richard, starting with you. Do you think that Chancellor Merkel will struggle to find that in the EU in the next 6 months?
Well, I think if anyone can do it, she can do it. I think Melinda put her finger on one thing that is very important, is this sense that she's approaching the end of her term. An Italian MEP who I spoke to just earlier was saying that that was her kind of privilege and something that she can really take advantage of in bringing people together.
And Melinda, one quick sentence.
She's known as a great negotiator. She's going to have the heads of the EU member states there live in person in mid-July to meet with her. Those are good, auspicious circumstances for good negotiation.
All right. Thank you very much for watching DW.